July 1942. Kokoda Track, Papua New Guinea. The jungle was so thick that men could not see more than 10 feet ahead. Rain poured down every single day. The temperature sat at 95 degrees. The air was so heavy with water that soldiers felt like they were breathing soup. And right through the middle of this green hell, 13,000 Japanese soldiers were marching straight toward Australia. Standing in their way were just 400 young Australians, most of them barely 18 years old. Within weeks, American officers watching from the sidelines would send reports back to headquarters that seemed impossible to believe. They would describe what these Australians did when their ammunition ran out, when every bullet was gone, when military rules said they should surrender or die. But that moment was still to come. Right now, in July 1942, almost nobody thought these young Australians could survive even a single week. The stakes could not have been higher. Port Moresby sat just 100 miles away on the other side of the mountains. If the Japanese captured that city, they would have a perfect jumping point to invade Australia itself. 15 million Australians would face enemy invasion for the first time in their history. Every military expert agreed that losing Port Moresby meant losing Australia. The Japanese knew it, the Americans knew it, and the 400 defenders standing in the jungle definitely knew it. But knowing something and being ready for it are two very different things. The Australian soldiers sent to stop this invasion were not the tough, experienced fighters that the situation demanded. They were called the 39th Battalion, and almost all of them were militia. That meant they were not professional soldiers. They were farmers, cattle ranchers, and shop workers who had signed up to defend their homes. Most came from tiny towns in the Australian outback, places so remote that some had never seen a paved road before joining the army. Their training lasted just 12 weeks. 12 weeks to learn how to be soldiers. 12 weeks to prepare for the hardest fighting in the world. The regular Australian soldiers had a cruel nickname for these militia troops. They called them chocos, short for chocolate soldiers. The name meant they would melt at the first sign of real heat, real danger, real combat. When orders came to send the 39th Battalion to stop the Japanese advance, experienced officers shook their heads. Some laughed, others got angry. Sending untrained boys into the jungle against Japan's best troops seemed like murder. It seemed like throwing lives away for nothing. The problems went far beyond just training. Everything the Australians had been taught about fighting came from British military books written for wars in Europe. Those tactics worked fine in the flat fields of France or Belgium. Fire your rifle at the enemy from 300 yards away. Stay in formation. Hold your ground in neat, organised lines. Advance slowly and carefully. But here in the jungle of New Guinea, those rules were completely useless. The trees grew so close together that a man could not see 300 yards. There were no flat fields, no open ground, no place for neat lines of soldiers. There were only mountains that rose straight up into the clouds, rivers that flooded without warning, and mud so deep it could swallow a man's boots. The British and American generals who planned Pacific strategy had another problem. They did not believe Western soldiers could fight effectively in the jungle at all. Reports from the first 6 months of war against Japan were terrifying. Japanese troops moved through jungles like ghosts. They attacked from every direction at once. They fought at night when other armies rested. They seemed comfortable in conditions that made British and American soldiers sick, exhausted, and confused. In Malaya, in Singapore, in the Philippines, in Burma, well-trained Allied forces had been crushed. The jungle belonged to Japan, and every expert agreed this was simply a fact of nature that could not be changed. American military observers arrived in Australia in June 1942 to see how the defence of Port Moresby was going. They toured the training camps. They watched the young Australian militia practising with their rifles. They read the plans for defending the Kokoda Track. Then they wrote reports that painted a dark picture. These boys were not ready. Their equipment was wrong for jungle fighting. Their tactics were outdated. Their officers had never seen real combat. The observers predicted that when the Japanese attack came, the 39th Battalion would break and run within 48 hours. Some gave them only 24 hours before total collapse. But something strange started happening in the first days of fighting. The Australian commanders on the ground, the ones actually facing the enemy, began to notice things the experts had missed. Yes, their soldiers were young and poorly trained. Yes, their equipment was wrong. Yes, their tactics did not work. But these young Australians had something else, something that did not appear in any training manual or military textbook. They had grown up in one of the harshest environments on Earth. The Australian outback taught brutal lessons about survival. It taught men to keep going when everything hurt, when water was gone, when the sun cooked them alive. It taught them that giving up meant dying, so you never gave up, not ever, not for any reason. As July turned to August and the first real battles began, the Australian officers realised something that would change everything. All the rules they had learned, all the proper ways to fight, all the tactics from all those British books meant nothing here. The jungle did not care about rules. The enemy did not fight by European standards. So why should they? The commanders looked at their young soldiers, these supposedly worthless chocos, and they made a decision that seemed crazy at the time. They would throw out the rule book completely. They would learn to fight in ways that would shock the military experts. They would get close to the enemy, so close they could hear them breathing. They would fight with whatever weapons they had, and when those ran out, they would fight with whatever they could grab. They would never surrender ground without making the Japanese pay in blood for every single foot. The American observers did not know it yet, but they were about to witness something that would force them to rewrite every assumption about jungle warfare. They were about to see what happened when young men with nothing to lose decided that running away was simply not an option, no matter what. The new way of fighting started with something simple but radical. Forget everything you learned in training, the Australian commanders told their men. Forget about shooting the enemy from 300 yards away. In the jungle, you will be lucky to see 30 feet in front of you. Most of your fights will happen at 15 yards or less. That is 50 feet, close enough to see the fear in another man's eyes. The Australians cut down the weight of everything their soldiers carried. Standard military packs weighed 70 pounds. That was impossible in mountains where every step was either straight up or straight down. They stripped it down to 40 pounds. Each man could now move 12 miles per day through terrain where other armies managed only 3 or 4 miles. They taught their soldiers to move in complete silence. Not a word, not a cough, not even the click of metal on metal. In the jungle, sound carried like a bell ringing. The side that stayed quiet lived. The side that made noise died. But the most shocking change was what happened when ammunition ran low. Every army in the world taught the same basic rule. Soldiers fight with guns. When the bullets run out, you retreat. You fall back to where there are more bullets. If you cannot retreat, you surrender. That was just common sense. That was survival. The Australian commanders looked at that rule and decided it was wrong. When your bullets run out, they told their men, you have 2 choices. You can die running away, or you can make the enemy die first. Fix your bayonets. Grab your entrenching tools. Those short shovels with the sharp edges are not just for digging anymore, they are weapons. And if you lose those, pick up rocks, pick up sticks, use your hands. But never stop fighting. Never give the enemy a single inch of ground for free. The first real test came in August 1942 at a place called Isurava. 400 Australian soldiers dug into positions on a ridge. Below them, 4,000 Japanese troops prepared to attack. The math was simple and terrible. 10 enemy soldiers for every one defender. The Japanese had been winning every jungle battle for 8 months straight. They expected to crush through the Australian line in a few hours, maybe by the end of one day at most. Instead, the battle lasted 4 days. 4 days of the most brutal close-range fighting imaginable. The Australians held their fire until the Japanese were so close they could not miss. 20 yards, 15 yards, sometimes 10 yards before the first shot was fired. They were not trying to win. They knew they could not win. They were trying to make the Japanese pay such a high price that the advance would slow down, would hesitate, would give Australia more time to prepare. When it was over, the Australians counted their ammunition. Each man had fired an average of just 10 rounds per engagement, 10 bullets per fight, because that was all they had. Yet the casualty numbers seemed impossible. For every one Australian killed, 3 Japanese soldiers died. The defenders were outnumbered 10 to 1, but the attackers were dying 3 times faster. American military observers who reviewed the battle reports assumed there was a mistake in the counting. Numbers like that did not happen in jungle warfare. Japan had been proving for months that Western armies simply could not compete in the jungle. Yet here were 400 untrained Australian militia doing exactly that. Back at MacArthur's headquarters in Australia, the reports from the Kokoda Track were met with deep suspicion. The tactics the Australians were using seemed reckless and undisciplined, charging the enemy with shovels and bayonets, fighting at 15 yards instead of 300, moving in complete silence instead of coordinating with radios and signals. These were not the methods of a professional army. American units preparing for their own jungle operations questioned whether they should learn anything from troops who ignored so many basic rules. The War Department sent observers to write official reports, and those observers predicted disaster. They wrote that the Australian approach might work for a few days or weeks, but would eventually fall apart completely. Modern warfare was won with firepower and technology, not with hand-to-hand fighting and improvised tactics. But one man saw something different in those battle reports. General Thomas Blamey commanded all Australian forces. He was a hard man who had fought in the First World War and knew what real combat looked like. When he read about what the 39th Battalion was doing, he did not see chaos or recklessness. He saw innovation born from absolute necessity. He saw soldiers who refused to lose even when every rule said they should. Blamey ordered his staff to document everything the Kokoda fighters were doing, every tactic, every technique, every lesson learned. He wanted other Australian units to learn these methods. He even suggested that American and British forces might benefit from understanding how these young militia were staying alive against impossible odds. Then came September 1942 and a place called Brigade Hill. This was when the American observers finally saw what the Australians were really capable of. The Japanese attacked in waves, thousands of troops pushing up the slopes. The Australians fired back with everything they had. But the attack kept coming and coming. Hours passed. The pile of empty bullet casings grew higher. Officers shouted for men to conserve ammunition, to make every shot count. Fire only when you can see the enemy clearly. Fire only when you cannot miss. Still, the attack continued. And then, after 36 hours of constant fighting, something happened that changed everything. The Australians ran out of bullets. Completely out. Not low on ammunition, not rationing the last few rounds. Actually, totally, completely out of bullets. By every rule of warfare ever written, the battle was over. The defenders had fought bravely, but now they had to retreat or surrender. Those were the only options. The American liaison officers, watching from a nearby position, expected to see the Australians fall back. Instead, they heard something that made their blood turn cold. They heard an Australian officer screaming orders to fix bayonets. They heard the sound of hundreds of shovels being pulled from packs. And then they heard something that seemed impossible. They heard the Australians charging forward, running toward the enemy, not away from them. What happened next lasted only minutes, but the American observers would remember it for the rest of their lives. 400 men with no bullets attacked 4,000 men who still had plenty of ammunition. They charged straight into Japanese positions with bayonets fixed and entrenching tools raised like axes. The fighting was so close that rifles became clubs. Men wrestled in the mud. Shovels clanged against rifle stocks. The sound was nothing like normal combat. It was the sound of metal on metal. Men screaming, bodies crashing through undergrowth. And when the Japanese finally pulled back, when they retreated down the hill, the Australians still held Brigade Hill. They held it with empty rifles and bent shovels and bloody hands. But they held it. The American officers sent their reports back to headquarters. One lieutenant colonel wrote that the Australians fought like wounded animals, absolutely fearless. A war correspondent who witnessed part of the battle wrote that when the Aussies ran out of ammunition, that was when they got angry, when they really started fighting. A Marine observer, a man who had seen combat in the Pacific and thought he understood what toughness meant, wrote something that his commanders initially refused to believe. He wrote that he had just watched the most terrifying display of fighting spirit he had ever witnessed in his entire military career. The numbers told a story that seemed almost impossible to believe. Before the Australians developed their new jungle tactics, Allied forces in the Pacific were achieving a jungle combat effectiveness rating of just 23%. That meant in every fight, the Allies were losing more than 3/4 of their engagements. After the Australians started fighting their way, their effectiveness jumped to 67%. They were now winning 2 out of every 3 fights. Even more shocking was the casualty exchange ratio in the early battles. For every single Australian soldier killed, more than 3 Japanese soldiers died in these initial engagements. The force that was supposed to melt like chocolate in the heat was instead destroying one of the most feared armies in the world. By November 1942, the Australian tactics had spread to 18,000 troops fighting across New Guinea. What started with 400 desperate militia had become the standard way that Australian forces fought in the jungle. Officers who had once mocked the Chocos were now begging to learn their methods. American units started requesting Australian advisors to teach them how to move silently, how to fight at close range, how to survive when everything seemed lost. The Australian military began producing specialised equipment based on what the Kokoda fighters had proven worked in real combat. 50,000 machetes were ordered, designed specifically for jungle fighting. 35,000 entrenching tools were modified with reinforced edges, officially recognising that these tools were now weapons as much as they were shovels. The most vivid proof of how effective these tactics were came in October 1942 at Eora Creek. The fighting there showed exactly what the Americans meant when they called the Australians terrifying. The rain had been falling for 3 days straight, without stopping. Everything was soaked. Clothes never dried. Skin turned white and soft from constant wetness. The temperature was 95 degrees, and the humidity was so thick it felt like trying to breathe underwater. Soldiers moved through the jungle in single file, one man behind another, because the undergrowth was too dense to walk side by side. The only sound was rain hitting leaves and the occasional snap of bamboo under someone's foot. Then the silence shattered. A Japanese patrol and an Australian patrol walked right into each other at a bend in the trail. The distance between them was less than 30 feet. For 90 seconds the jungle exploded with gunfire. Muzzle flashes lit up the green shadows. Bullets tore through leaves and bark. Men shouted and screamed. And then, as suddenly as it started, the shooting stopped. Both sides had emptied their rifles. In any other army, this would be the moment when soldiers retreated, fell back, tried to reload and regroup. Instead, the Australians charged forward with a sound that froze the Japanese in place. It was not an organised battle cry. It was something more animal than human, a roar of pure rage and determination. What happened next lasted maybe 2 minutes, but felt like hours to anyone caught in it. The sound of steel on steel rang through the jungle as bayonets clashed with rifle stocks. Entrenching tools swung through the air with sickening thuds. Men grappled in the mud, rolling through puddles, clawing and punching. An Australian soldier's rifle broke in half. He kept fighting with the splintered stock, using it like a club. Another man lost his entrenching tool in the chaos and picked up a rock the size of his fist. The Japanese troops, who had been winning every jungle engagement for nearly a year, broke first. They pulled back, they retreated. They left the trail to the Australians. When the medics arrived 30 minutes later, they found Australian soldiers sitting in the mud, shaking from exhaustion and adrenaline. Their knuckles were bloody and swollen. Their entrenching tools were bent from the force of impact, metal twisted out of shape from hitting bone and equipment. Some men gripped their empty rifles so tightly that their fingers had cramped and locked in place. They had to pry the weapons out of their own hands. This was what fighting looked like when ammunition was gone. This was what the Americans were witnessing and reporting back to headquarters in messages that seemed too extreme to be true. The quotes from American observers grew more intense with each battle. Lieutenant Colonel Bert Zima, who had flown bombing missions across the Pacific and considered himself tough, wrote that the Aussies fought like they were personally offended by the enemy's existence. A war correspondent who had covered fighting in Europe and North Africa watched an Australian unit hold a position for 8 hours with almost no ammunition. He wrote in his dispatch that when their ammo ran out, that was when they got angry. That was when the real fighting began. A Marine observer named Captain James Sullivan was sent specifically to evaluate whether American forces should learn Australian tactics. He watched a single Australian platoon, just 35 men, hold off a Japanese company of 200 for an entire day. In his official report, he wrote something his commanders initially thought was an exaggeration for effect. He wrote that he had just watched the most savage display of close-quarters combat in the history of modern warfare, and that every Marine in the Pacific should be trained in Australian methods immediately. The Japanese noticed too, and their response proved just how effective the Australian tactics really were. Japanese commanders started issuing specific warnings about Australian units. Documents captured later in the war showed that Japanese soldiers called the Australians forest demons. Officers told their men to avoid engaging Australian positions if at all possible. If you must attack Australians, the orders said, do it with overwhelming force and be prepared for casualties 3 times higher than normal. One Japanese soldier's diary, found on his body after a battle, contained a note that was later translated. It said that fighting the Australians was different from fighting other Allied troops. The Australians, he wrote, did not stop fighting when they should. They did not understand when they were beaten. Trying to defeat them was like trying to stop a flood with your bare hands. The scale of what the Australians accomplished over 4 months shocked military analysts. 625 Australians died defending the Kokoda Track. The number was terrible. Every single one of those young men mattered. But the Japanese lost over 12,000 soldiers trying to take the same ground. The math was brutal and clear. For every Australian killed in action, the Japanese lost 19 men. An untrained militia force of mostly teenagers had inflicted casualties at a rate that professional armies with years of experience could not match. The Japanese advanced toward Port Moresby, which every expert predicted would take 3 weeks at most, took 4 months and ultimately failed completely. Australia was never invaded. The turning point of the Pacific War happened on a muddy jungle track defended by men who were never supposed to win anything. Other Allied forces began studying what the Australians had done. British officers arrived to observe training exercises. Chinese units requested Australian instructors. Even the Americans, who had the largest and best-equipped military in the world, started sending soldiers to learn from these bushfighters. The weapons factories in Australia changed their production schedules based on what worked in actual combat. Lighter packs, stronger shovels, quieter equipment. Everything was redesigned around the lessons learned in the jungle. The military experts who had predicted the Australian tactics would fail, went silent. Some wrote new papers explaining why the tactics worked. Others simply stopped talking about their earlier predictions. The facts on the ground were impossible to argue with. The chocolate soldiers had not melted. They had become the most effective jungle fighters in the entire Pacific Theatre. And still, the Americans kept writing reports about what they witnessed, each one trying to capture something that seemed impossible to put into words. How do you explain the moment when men with no ammunition charge towards certain death and somehow survive? How do you describe the sound of shovels being used as weapons? How do you measure the kind of fighting spirit that treats running out of bullets not as the end of the battle, but as the beginning of something even more desperate and determined? The observers kept trying to find the right words, but the truth was simple and terrible and magnificent all at once. They had watched human beings decide that losing was simply not acceptable, no matter the cost, no matter the odds, no matter what the rule book said about when you were supposed to give up. The transformation happened faster than anyone expected. By February 1943, just 5 months after the Kokoda Track campaign ended, the US Marine Raiders were training in Australian jungle tactics. These were America's elite troops, the toughest fighters in the Pacific, and they were learning how to fight from the same militia that military experts had dismissed as chocolate soldiers just months earlier. The British formed special units called the Chindits to fight behind enemy lines in Burma. They specifically requested Australian officers to train them. Chinese forces preparing to defend their homeland against Japanese invasion asked for Australian instructors to teach them close-quarters combat. The tactics that started with 400 desperate teenagers in the mountains of New Guinea had become the foundation for how every Allied soldier would learn to fight in the jungle. In 1944, the United States Army made it official. They published Field Manual 72-20, The Doctrine for Jungle Warfare. Inside that manual, written in official military language and distributed to every unit preparing for Pacific combat, were the tactics developed by Australian soldiers on the Kokoda Track. Close-range engagement procedures, silent movement techniques, instructions for using entrenching tools as weapons, guidelines for fighting effectively when ammunition was depleted. Every American soldier who went into the jungle from that point forward was trained using methods that Australian militia had invented while trying desperately not to die. Military historians who studied the manual later calculated that 75% of US jungle warfare training was based directly on Australian innovations. The country with the smallest military had taught the country with the largest military how to win. The recognition came slowly for the men who actually did the fighting. In 1943, the 39th Battalion received the Presidential Unit Citation from the United States government. This was an extremely rare honour for a non-American unit. The citation praised their extraordinary heroism and outstanding performance against overwhelming odds, but the public never really heard about it. During the war, the newspapers focused on big battles with thousands of troops, not small desperate actions on jungle trails. After the war ended, the stories that got told were about famous generals and major campaigns. The young men who held Brigade Hill with bent shovels and empty rifles went home to their farms and their small towns. Most of them never talked much about what they had done. When they did talk, people often did not believe them. Fighting with shovels? Charging machine guns with no ammunition? It sounded like exaggeration, like stories that got bigger with each telling, but in military circles, among the officers and soldiers who understood combat, the Kokoda fighters became legends. The survivors of the 39th Battalion became instructors. They taught American Marines how to move silently through dense vegetation. They taught British commandos how to fight at 15 yards instead of 300. They taught Chinese soldiers how to turn desperation into a weapon. These men, who had never wanted to be soldiers, who had signed up only to defend their homes, became the teachers who shaped how 3 different armies learned to fight. A farm boy from rural Australia would stand in front of a room full of professional soldiers and explain exactly how to use an entrenching tool to kill an enemy at close range. And those professional soldiers listened carefully and took notes because they knew this man had actually done it, had actually survived it, had actually won battles that every military textbook said could not be won. The deeper story, the one that mattered more than tactics and training manuals, was about what happens when human beings decide that giving up is simply not possible. The Australians on the Kokoda Track were not supposed to win. They had the wrong training, the wrong equipment, and the wrong odds. Every expert who looked at their situation said the same thing. They would lose. They would lose quickly. The only question was whether they would lose in 2 days or 3 days. But those experts had measured everything except the one thing that actually mattered most. They had not measured what happens when people decide they would rather die fighting than die running. They had not accounted for the strange mathematics of absolute determination, where being outnumbered stops mattering because surrender is simply removed from the list of possible choices. Innovation, the real kind that changes everything, usually does not come from planning. It comes from necessity. It comes from situations where the old ways have failed so completely that trying something new is the only option left. The Australian commanders did not sit in offices developing new tactics through careful study and experimentation. They developed new tactics because their soldiers were dying and nothing they had been taught in training was working. Sometimes the most effective approach to a problem is to throw away everything you think you know and start from what actually works, even if it looks wrong, even if it seems crazy, even if every expert says it cannot possibly succeed. The lessons from the Kokoda Track did not stay in 1942. Modern special forces still train in Australian close quarters jungle combat techniques. When American soldiers fought in the dense forests of Afghanistan, they used principles developed on muddy trails in New Guinea. When British troops needed to clear buildings in Iraq, they adapted tactics that came directly from fighting at 15 yards in the jungle. The specifics changed. The weapons got more advanced. The technology got better. But the core idea remained exactly the same. Sometimes you have to get close to the enemy. Sometimes ammunition runs low or runs out. Sometimes survival depends on being willing to fight with whatever you have, even if what you have is just a shovel and your own 2 hands and absolute refusal to quit. The never quit mindset, which had been just a desperate necessity in 1942, became formalized doctrine. Military psychologists studied it. Training programs were designed around it. Officers learned to recognize it in their troops and to encourage it. The idea that determination could be as important as firepower, that could matter as much as weapons, became accepted truth in every professional military in the world. But it started with teenagers in a jungle who had never been in combat before and who chose to charge forward when everything said they should run away. The American troops who watched the Australians fight at Brigade Hill were asked years later what they remembered most clearly. Many of them gave variations of the same answer. They said they learned the difference between soldiers and warriors that day. Soldiers, they explained, fight with weapons. Give a soldier a rifle and bullets, and he will fight well. Take away the rifle and bullets, and the fight is over. But warriors are different. Warriors fight with will. The weapons matter less than the decision that losing is not acceptable. When the Australians ran out of bullets, the Americans said that was not the end of the fight. That was when the real fighting started. That was when they understood that they were not watching an army in the traditional sense. They were watching something older and more primal, something that went back to the very beginning of human conflict, when survival was the only goal and surrender meant death. The greatest weapon, those observers concluded, is not something you carry. It is something you embody. It is something inside that either exists or does not exist, something that no amount of training can truly create if it is not already there in some small seed waiting to grow. Determination, when it becomes absolute, when it reaches the point where death seems preferable to defeat, transforms into its own kind of armament. It cannot be counted like bullets. It cannot be measured like artillery shells. But it can change the outcome of battles that seem already decided. It can make 400 men stronger than 13,000. It can turn boys into legends and defeat into victory. The Kokoda Track taught the world that sometimes the side with less of everything wins, because they have more of the one thing that matters most. They have the absolute unwillingness to accept any outcome except survival and victory, even when every reasonable calculation says both are impossible.